Jacob's Journey, a tale of trust and redemption. Let me tell you a story, my story. It's one that starts on a seemingly ordinary October morning, but soon unravels into an extraordinary journey filled with challenges, trust, and redemption. My name is Jacob, and I want you to immerse yourself in a tale of unexpected twists, where every decision carried weight and every moment tested my resolve. What began as a simple day in October turned into a defining chapter of my life, and I'm here to share every vivid detail with you. It all began as the sun struggled to rise, casting a pale orange glow that barely cut through the October fog. My mornings were always a mix of the mundane and comforting, the clatter of pans, the soft hiss of the kettle, and the unmistakable scent of freshly brewed tea mingling with toast slightly burned around the edges. My aunt, Mrs. Jones, was already bustling about the kitchen, humming an old tune that made the house feel alive. She'd been up since 5 as always, and her sharp voice soon pierced through the morning stillness. "Jacob, it's time to get up," she called, her voice resonating with a kind of authority that could pull me out of the deepest slumber. I groaned softly, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth my bed provided, but there was no arguing with Aunt Jones. The brisk October morning greeted me unkindly as my feet met the cold wooden floor, a sensation sharp enough to fully rouse me. I stood still for a moment, shivering as the chill seeped into my skin, but the aroma wafting from the kitchen offered solace. The scent of tea, brewed strong and just the way I liked it, mingled with hints of freshly toasted bread. It was an unspoken promise of comfort, urging me to get moving. I stretched lazily, my joints cracking in protest, before heading downstairs, one reluctant step at a time. The house was a mix of warmth and activity, the kitchen radiating light and life as my aunt worked her magic. The sounds of her movements, the scrape of a pan, the clink of a spoon against a cup, were oddly soothing, a reminder of the steadiness she brought to our lives. "You're finally up," she remarked without turning, her tone somewhere between teasing and chastising. Her hands moved deftly, flipping something on the stove. "Good morning," I mumbled, still shaking off the last vestiges of sleep. She glanced at me then, her expression softening as she handed me a plate. "Eat up," she said. "You've got a long day ahead, and the world doesn't wait for late risers." I settled into the familiar rhythm of breakfast, the toast warm and buttered to perfection, the tea cutting through the morning fog in my head. As I ate, she moved about the kitchen, a constant flurry of activity. Her hum, a tune I'd heard 100 times, filled the space, adding to its comforting familiarity. "Don't forget to wear your coat," she added absently, glancing toward the door. "It's colder than it looks." As I descended the stairs, the warmth of the kitchen enveloped me. My aunt stood by the stove, her movements precise yet hurried, as if she was racing against some invisible clock. She turned to glance at me, her expression a mix of fondness and concern. "Good morning, Jacob," she said, handing me a plate. "Eat up. You have a long day ahead." I ate quickly, the silence between us comfortable but weighted with unspoken words. Before leaving, I leaned over to kiss her cheek. "Take care of yourself," she said, her worry evident even in those few words. I nodded, offering a reassuring smile. Little did I know how much I'd come to replay that moment in my mind later. After breakfast, I set out for the day, the familiar weight of my bag slung over my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Jacob," my aunt said, her voice tinged with a kind of concern that only deep love could carry. She'd always been protective of me, and for good reason. Since taking up my job as a truck driver, I'd been navigating long hours, unpredictable routes, and the loneliness of endless roads. Each trip was a test of endurance, not just for me, but for her too, as she worried about my safety with every goodbye. That morning, her usual farewell felt heavier. She lingered by the doorway as I pulled on my coat, her eyes scanning me as though memorizing every detail. "Don't skip meals," she added, her tone firm. "And call me if anything feels off." I smiled, stepping forward to kiss her cheek. "I will," I promised, though I knew her worry would persist long after I was out of sight. The air outside was sharp and bracing, a stark contrast to the warmth of our kitchen. As I walked down the quiet street, the world seemed serene, but there was an unease in the back of my mind, a feeling that today wouldn't be like any other. I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the rhythm of my steps and the distant hum of the approaching bus. As I walked down the street to catch the bus, the world around me felt still, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath for something unknown. The soft hum of early morning activity, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, added to the calm. Yet, within me, a peculiar unease grew, like a whisper that refused to be ignored. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from a tangible threat, but rather a nagging sense that the day ahead would unravel in ways I couldn't foresee. Reaching the corner, the hiss and groan of an approaching bus broke my train of thought. Its headlights pierced through the lingering fog, illuminating the damp pavement and casting long shadows against the shopfronts. The doors creaked open with a metallic whine, and I stepped aboard, nodding to the driver whose tired eyes betrayed a long morning. I chose a window seat near the back, my usual spot, where I could watch the world wake up. The town's familiar streets rolled by, their quiet charm unchanged. The bakery with its lights just flickering on, the cobbler arranging shoes in his display, and the lone runner braving the cold. Yet, my gaze lingered longer on each scene, as if I might not see them again. The bus's engine hummed steadily, a soothing rhythm that contrasted with the growing unrest inside me. As we passed the outskirts of town, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the fields and trees in a gray haze. The faint outline of the hills seemed distant and unreal, as though the world itself had shifted. The unease that had begun as a whisper now grew louder, an almost tangible weight pressing on my chest. I clutched my bag tighter, absently tracing its worn leather strap. Was it the weather, the fog, or something deeper that unsettled me? The bus carried me ever closer to the depot, where my route to Manchester would begin. Each mile felt heavier, as if the uncharted territory ahead wasn't just physical but something far more profound. A journey into the unknown, where every choice would matter and every step could alter the course of the day, or even my life. The streets were still waking up when I started driving, the faint light of dawn barely illuminating the winding road ahead. My cargo for the day was straightforward, a load of biscuits bound for a warehouse in Manchester. The drive itself was supposed to be uneventful, a routine journey through quiet stretches of countryside. The rain began to fall lightly, droplets streaking across the windshield as the world outside blurred into shades of gray. The rhythmic patter against the glass was almost soothing, lulling me into the monotony of the task. But as the road stretched on, the stillness was broken by a figure up ahead. He stood by the side of the road, drenched from head to toe, his red jersey clinging to him under the relentless rain. He looked young, no older than 16, his jeans muddied from the splashes of passing cars. One hand clutched a small, battered backpack, while the other was extended in a desperate attempt to hitch a ride. Something about his stance, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made me slow down. I pulled over, the wipers sweeping back and forth in steady intervals as I lowered the window. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of rain and the hum of the truck's engine. "Manchester," he replied, his voice steady but edged with exhaustion. His face, partially obscured by damp strands of hair, bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had been through more than just a tough day. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "Please, I won't cause any trouble." I nodded, unlocking the door. "Hop in," I said, watching as he climbed into the cab, shaking off the rain as best he could. He introduced himself as John, his words careful, as though he wasn't used to trusting strangers. As the truck began moving again, we fell into a tentative rhythm of conversation, his story slowly unfolding with each mile. John had run away from home after a heated argument with his uncle, the man who had taken him in after his parents passed away. His voice trembled as he recounted how the tension between them had escalated over time, his uncle's strict rules leaving little room for freedom. "He's always been controlling," John admitted, staring out at the rain-streaked road. "Last night, it just got worse. I couldn't take it anymore." I listened, my hands steady on the wheel as the truck rumbled along. There was a fragility to John's story, but also a quiet strength, a resilience born out of necessity. As the rain continued to fall, the atmosphere in the cab shifted, the shared space becoming a small refuge from the storm outside and the turmoil of his life. Something about him made me pull over. "Where are you headed?" I asked as he climbed into the cab, shaking off the rain. "Manchester," he replied, his voice soft but steady, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a long and difficult night. He introduced himself as John, his words careful and measured, as if testing whether I could be trusted. As we began talking, his story started to unfold in fragmented sentences that carried the weight of suppressed emotions. He explained how his parents had passed away years ago, leaving him in the care of his uncle, Robert Stevens. At first, things had been fine, he admitted, but over time, his uncle's overbearing nature turned their relationship sour. "He always meant well, I think," John said, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, but he couldn't see how his rules were suffocating me. The tension between them had simmered for months, fueled by disagreements about John's friends, his hobbies, and his need for independence. "Last night," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "it finally boiled over. I told him I was going out to see a film with my friends. He said no, like he always does. But this time, I went anyway." John's hands fidgeted as he spoke, as though replaying the events in his mind. He described returning home late, his uncle waiting for him at the door. The argument that ensued was fierce, words thrown like daggers in the heat of anger. "He hit me," John admitted quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain outside. "And I hit him back. I didn't mean to hurt him, but I couldn't stay there anymore." He fell silent after that, his eyes dropping to his lap as if ashamed to meet my gaze. I could see the conflict within him, a young man caught between guilt and the need to justify his actions. My hands remained steady on the wheel as I absorbed his story, the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine filling the heavy silence that followed. There was a fragility to John's demeanor, but also an undeniable resilience, a determination to carve out a path for himself despite the odds stacked against him. We stopped at a cafe to warm up, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the damp chill outside. Over steaming cups of tea, John began to open up, his words coming slowly at first, then spilling out like a dam had broken. He'd sneaked out the previous night to see a film with friends, an act of rebellion against his uncle's stringent rules. I just wanted to feel normal," he said, staring into his cup as though it held the answers he was searching for. "But when I got back, he was waiting for me." John's voice faltered as he recounted the confrontation that had followed, his words stumbling over memories he seemed reluctant to relive. He was furious. His face turned red, and he started yelling, louder than I'd ever heard before. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. It was like he wasn't even hearing me anymore. John's hand tightened around his teacup, his knuckles whitening as though he were gripping onto the past itself. Then, he hit me, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not just a slap, but a real hit. It shocked me. It hurt. And before I even knew what I was doing, I hit him back. His words hung in the air, heavy with raw emotion, as if he were confessing to something far worse than a simple reaction. I didn't mean to. I just reacted. It was like everything boiled over all at once. John's gaze fell to the table, his posture collapsing inward as though trying to make himself smaller. I shouldn't have done it, he added softly. But it just happened. And after that, I couldn't stay there anymore. The way he spoke, each word trembling on the edge of regret, painted a vivid picture of a boy caught in the storm of his own emotions, unable to escape the weight of what had unfolded. The vulnerability in his voice was striking, each word carrying the weight of regret and confusion. I didn't press him for more details, sensing that he was struggling to process it himself. Instead, I offered him a quiet nod, letting him know I was listening without judgment. It was then that something caught my eye, a newspaper left behind on the counter. I picked it up absent-mindedly, scanning the headlines, until one stopped me cold. Man found dead in Bristol. The name in the article sent a chill through me. Robert Stevens, John's uncle. I looked up at the boy across from me, his hands clutching his tea as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. Could he have done it? The pieces of the puzzle were unsettling, but as John's wide, terrified eyes met mine, something in me refused to believe he was capable of such a thing. I didn't, he whispered, almost as if he could hear the question forming in my mind. I didn't do it. I didn't press him for details, sensing his shame and confusion. But then, as I sipped my tea, my eyes wandered to a newspaper left abandoned on the counter nearby. Its damp edges curled slightly from the humidity of the cafe, but the bold headline was unmistakable: Man found dead in Bristol. My heart sank as I read further, the details chillingly specific. The victim was Robert Stevens, John's uncle. I froze, my fingers tightening around the fragile porcelain cup. It wasn't just the name that shook me, it was the realization that the timeline fit perfectly with John's escape. Questions swirled in my mind, doubts creeping in like shadows. Could he have done it? Could this scared boy sitting across from me, clutching his tea like it was his lifeline, really be capable of such a heinous act? I glanced up at him, his eyes darting to mine as though he could sense my unease. I didn't, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the cafe. I swear, I didn't do it. His trembling hands betrayed the weight of his words, but there was something in his gaze, a desperation, a pleading honesty, that made me hesitate to judge. The pieces of the puzzle didn't align neatly, but one thing was clear: the boy in front of me wasn't just running from the police. He was running from a nightmare. I glanced at the boy across the table, his hands clutching his tea as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Could he have done it? The thought seemed absurd and yet unervingly plausible, like a riddle with no clear answer. John's insistence that he hadn't committed the crime echoed in my mind, but the pieces of the puzzle, his sudden flight, the timing, the victim, all pointed ominously toward him. The police were convinced he was the culprit, their certainty woven into every line of the headline I'd read. Still, as I studied John's trembling hands and wide, terrified eyes, I found it hard to reconcile the frightened boy in front of me with the image of a murderer. The journey continued, tension mounting with every mile. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, streaking the windows and blending the world into a blur of gray. Suddenly, the faint glimmer of flashing lights in the distance grew brighter. A police checkpoint loomed ahead, stark and foreboding under the overcast sky. My heart raced as I slowed the truck, my mind spinning with possible scenarios. What would they ask? Could I keep calm enough to convince them? As the truck rolled closer, I could see the officers moving with mechanical precision, their silhouettes sharp against the harsh glare of rotating patrol lights. Each motion was deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though they had done this 100 times before. One officer stepped forward, his posture stiff and commanding, raising a gloved hand to signal me to stop. The truck's brakes let out a long hissing sigh as I eased the vehicle to a halt. Rolling down the window, I adjusted my expression, masking my growing anxiety with a veneer of calm neutrality, though my heart raced beneath the surface. "Good afternoon," the officer said briskly, his eyes darting between my face and the cluttered interior of the cab. "We're looking for a boy, about 16. Red jersey, jeans. Said to be traveling alone, likely hitchhiking. Have you seen anyone matching that description on the road?" His words were clipped, rehearsed, as if he had repeated the question to countless other drivers before me. His tone carried both authority and urgency, making it clear this was no routine inquiry. I hesitated for the briefest moment, my thoughts racing through every possibility. Should I tell the truth, risk exposing him, or maintain the lie I wasn't even sure I could carry? "No, officer," I said evenly, forcing my tone to remain steady. "I haven't seen anyone like that." The words emerged slowly, carefully measured, yet they felt like stones sinking in water. My mind reeled with the weight of the choice I had just made, knowing full well that it could change everything. The officer's gaze lingered on me, his eyes scanning every inch of my face, searching for a crack, a tell, anything that might betray me. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, a relentless rhythm that refused to calm. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, silently willing myself to stay composed. I kept my breathing steady, forcing the mask of calmness to remain intact. After what felt like an eternity, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he stepped back. "Drive safely," he said, his tone clipped and curt, as if dismissing me while still harboring doubt. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of nerves raging within me. As the checkpoint disappeared in the rearview mirror, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension in my shoulders began to ease, but my mind remained heavy with the weight of my decision. "Why did you help me?" John asked once we were clear of the checkpoint, his voice breaking the heavy silence in the cab. It was a question loaded with gratitude, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of disbelief. He looked at me with a mix of fear and hope, his hands still clutching the edges of his seat as though bracing for whatever was to come. It wasn't just a question about the checkpoint, it was about why someone would take a chance on him, a boy running from something even he couldn't fully articulate. I thought for a moment before replying, weighing the consequences of my words. "Because I don't think you did it," I finally said, my voice steady yet filled with conviction. Sometimes, the truth doesn't lie in what people say or what the evidence suggests. It's in what you see in someone's eyes. And in yours, I see fear, regret, but not guilt. By the time we reached Manchester, I'd formulated a plan. While I delivered my cargo, I told John to stay out of sight. Meanwhile, I sought out an old contact of mine, Jeff. Jeff and I had a complicated history, a mix of shared struggles and diverging paths. Years ago, when I left the shadows of the criminal world behind, Jeff chose to stay, building a reputation as a man who knew everything about everyone. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. His name carried weight in Manchester, but it also carried the echoes of risks I thought I'd left behind. Jeff ran a cabaret club, an elegant yet shadowy establishment where the music never stopped, and the whispers of clandestine deals filled the air. It wasn't just a club, it was a crossroads for those who thrived in the city's underbelly. When I arrived, Jeff greeted me with open arms, his grin as sharp as the suit he wore. "Well, well, Jacob," he said, clapping me on the back. "Long time no see. What brings you back to my little kingdom?" We settled into a corner booth, the dim lighting casting flickering shadows over the scarred wood of the table. Drinks arrived, and as I sipped the whiskey Jeff insisted I try, I laid out the situation, sparing no detail. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. After a pause, he leaned back, a sly smile playing on his lips. "I think I know someone who can help," he said. "Bob Steele. He's the man you want. Lives down by the river in Bristol. If there's dirt to uncover, he's already got his hands in it. I'll make a call." True to his word, Jeff disappeared for a few minutes, leaving me alone in the dimly lit booth, the faint hum of the club's activities filling the air. When he returned, his demeanor was calm but purposeful. "Bob's expecting you," he said, sliding a slip of paper across the table. On it was an address, written in his precise and deliberate handwriting. "Go to this spot by the river," he added. "Just tell him I sent you, and he'll talk." He paused, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But be careful, Jacob. Bob's a useful ally, but he's got his own set of rules. Cross him, even accidentally, and things won't end well. He doesn't tolerate mistakes, and he never forgets a slight." I took the paper, nodding in understanding, though the warning lingered in the air like a shadow, heavy and foreboding. Jeff's sharp eyes held mine for a moment longer, as if daring me to acknowledge the full weight of his advice. Then, with the practiced ease of a man who'd mastered the art of detachment, he leaned back into the plush seat. His grin returned, smooth and unreadable, as if the gravity of his words had been swallowed by the club's smoky ambience. "Good luck," he said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. The amber liquid swirled as he took a slow sip, his gaze already shifting toward a new arrival at the bar, leaving me alone with the burden of what lay ahead. While I worked on finding answers, John had his own adventure in the bustling streets of Manchester. Wandering aimlessly, he found himself outside a cinema where he met a girl named Susan. She was standing by the ticket booth, her expression a mix of impatience and uncertainty. Striking up a conversation, they discovered a shared sense of displacement and quickly bonded over their struggles. Susan spoke of her complicated relationship with her overbearing family, and John found solace in her understanding demeanor. They decided to watch a film together, hoping to escape their troubles, if only for a while. Inside the cinema, the dim lighting and hum of the audience created a brief sanctuary. But as they left the theater, their newfound peace was shattered when Susan's ex-boyfriend, Steve, appeared. Tall and broad-shouldered, Steve's anger was evident the moment he spotted them. Words quickly escalated into shouts, and before long, Steve lunged at John. John tried to defend himself, but Steve's size and aggression gave him the upper hand. The scuffle drew the attention of passers-by, some of whom began to gather, watching the confrontation unfold. I arrived just in time, pushing through the crowd and stepping between them. "That's enough," I shouted, my voice firm and commanding. Steve hesitated, his fists still clenched, before reluctantly stepping back. As the tension eased, I placed a firm hand on John's shoulder, guiding him and Susan away from the scene. Steve stood frozen in the background, his chest heaving with unspent rage, but he made no move to follow. John was visibly shaken, his face pale and his breath shallow, while Susan's concern was palpable as she clung to his arm for support. "Thank you," John murmured, his voice barely audible over the noise of the dispersing crowd. His words carried a raw sincerity, the gratitude of someone who had just narrowly escaped something far worse. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up," he added, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. I offered a reassuring nod, my gaze briefly flicking back toward Steve, whose heaving chest and clenched fists were now fading into the shadows. The tension in the air lingered, but his presence no longer felt like an immediate threat. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice calm but carrying an unspoken urgency. With Susan holding tightly to John's arm, and John casting nervous glances behind us, we moved quickly through the bustling city streets, weaving between the crowds as the bright lights of Manchester enveloped us. The chaos we had left behind seemed distant with each step, though its weight still lingered heavily in our minds. With Jeff's lead in hand, we returned to Bristol under a heavy veil of uncertainty. Finding Bob Steele wasn't easy. His world was one of hushed whispers, guarded gazes, and closed doors. But Jeff's name carried weight, and after some persistence, we were granted an audience in a dimly lit pub by the river. Bob was a wiry man with sharp features and an air of constant vigilance. He spoke in clipped sentences, his words laced with suspicion, but Jeff's endorsement softened his stance just enough. Bob leaned in over the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "Robert Stevens wasn't an angel," he said, his eyes darting to the shadows around us as if they could listen. "He had his hands in all kinds of dirty deals, smuggling, debts, you name it. But this," he paused, tapping the edge of his glass, "this wasn't about money. It was personal. A rival of his wanted him gone, permanently. Your boy John. He's just a pawn in a bigger game. Wrong place, wrong time." The revelation hit hard. John had been swept into a conflict far beyond his understanding, a storm of greed and power struggles that had nothing to do with him. Bob's tone turned grim. "The man who did this is ruthless. The kind who doesn't leave loose ends. If you want justice for the kid, you'd better move fast." Leaving the pub, the weight of Bob's words pressed down on us. The truth had been unearthed, but it came with new dangers. John wasn't just innocent, he was vulnerable, and the forces at play wouldn't hesitate to target him again if they felt threatened. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about keeping him alive. The police, armed with Bob's information, arrested the real culprit after a swift and decisive operation. The rival, a man with a history of violence and intimidation, was caught attempting to flee the city. As evidence mounted against him, the truth of Robert Stevens' dealings came fully to light, revealing a tangled web of corruption that had ensnared many others. John's name was finally cleared, but the process had taken its toll on him. I saw the weight of it all in his eyes as we stood on the steps of the police station that final day. His gaze, once bright with youthful curiosity, now seemed shadowed by the burdens he'd borne. The scars weren't just emotional, they were etched into his demeanor, in the way he carried himself, shoulders slightly hunched, as though bracing for a storm that had already passed but left its chill lingering. The past few weeks had aged him in ways that no young man should experience, stripping away layers of innocence and replacing them with a hard-won resilience. "I don't know what's next," John admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared down at the ground, scuffing the dirt with his shoe. "But I can't let this define me. I have to start over. Somewhere far away from all of this. Somewhere I can figure out who I am without all of this hanging over me. His shoulders sagged slightly as he spoke, the weight of his words emphasizing the enormity of his decision. The resolve in his voice was undeniable, yet there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if he was speaking the words aloud to convince himself they were true. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You'll figure it out," I said with conviction. "You've got the strength to move forward. Just remember, you don't have to carry it all alone." As we parted ways, he vowed to build a better life, free from the shadows of his past. His words carried a determination I hadn't seen before, a quiet resolve that gave me hope for his future. Watching him walk away, his shoulders slightly hunched but his step steady, I felt a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride because he had survived a trial that could have broken him, and sorrow because I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The weight of his experiences would linger, shaping him in ways neither of us could predict, but I believed in his resilience, in his ability to rise above the circumstances he had been thrown into. And as for me, I returned to my routine, the hum of the road and the solitude of my truck offering a strange comfort. Yet, this time, the monotony felt different. Each mile I drove carried a new weight, a sense of clarity I hadn't felt before. I replayed the events of the past weeks in my mind, each decision, each twist of fate, and realized how deeply they had shaped me. I carried with me not just the satisfaction of knowing I had made a difference for John, but also the knowledge that I had grown through the experience, a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of uncertainty. Life is unpredictable, a tapestry woven with challenges that reveal the depths of our character. That day, I faced decisions that tested my resolve, moments where the line between right and easy blurred. But through it all, I learned an invaluable truth. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. This journey was not just about helping John find justice, it was a profound testament to the interconnectedness of our lives. Every decision I made and every moment I spent listening, believing, and acting revealed the potential we all have to lift someone out of the darkness. The courage to act when it's difficult, the compassion to truly hear someone's story, and the willingness to believe in someone when the world casts doubt. These are the choices that define us. They create ripples, touching not just one life but countless others in ways we may never fully understand. Thank you for taking the time to hear my story. I hope it serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness or bravery can illuminate the path forward, not just for one life, but for many. Compassion and courage are powerful forces. They don't just change lives, they save them.